Marion has integrated projects at Logan in 6. She conducts outreach and research on IPM with a focus on fruits and landscape ornamentals. She received her master's in plant pathology from Oregon State University and is originally from North Carolina. I'm so happy that she agreed to join us today, and clearly her topic is one that we all need a lot of information about. So I'm going to turn it over to her. And again, if you have any questions for me specifically, put them in the chat window. If you have questions for Marion, put those in the Q&A window.
Thank you so much, Megan. So the volume is good? Hear me all right?
You sound good to me.
Okay, good. As Megan said, she's going to be checking the Q&A or chat boxes for questions. So as we go along, if you have them, she'll interrupt me and I can answer it if it's pertinent to what I'm talking about. And I know you guys are from the East Coast to the West Coast. Hopefully some of this content will be pertinent to you. I am going to... One second. Oh, my screen just locked up.
That's okay. Push escape. Sometimes.
Okay.
There we go.
Thank you.
No worries.
Okay. All right. And so what I was saying was a lot of the times you're going to hear me say in Utah or in Intermountain West. So again, hopefully the content can be pertinent to you guys. So I just want to explain a little bit about cankers in general and their management. And it took me a while to narrow down what specific canker diseases to talk about. So it'll range from Cytospora, 1,000 cankers, a few lookalikes. So we'll get started with, in general, a canker is an area where a pathogen, fungus or bacteria, has killed the bark and the underlying tissue. And of course, the response by the tree can vary depending on the pathogen or the tree itself. And general symptoms you might encounter with a canker on the far left would be discoloration of the bark, of course, because it's dead. The bark may become sunken and the bark may flake off in patchy areas shown on the right. In addition, some canker-causing pathogens can cause the tree, or the tree responds by oozing, whether it's a thick gumming on the far left or just some sap, dark-colored sap, or maybe even pitch. And then finally, cankers may appear as swollen areas on the trunk or on branches. But to really tell, is it a canker caused by a pathogen? We have to look a little bit more closely. There may be some signs of, if it's caused by a fungus, shown on the far left. Those small black dots are fruiting bodies of a fungus that cause that canker, or scraping off the bark and looking underneath at the phloem or the xylem tissue underneath will be discolored and may range from black to a cinnamon brown color. So I always have my knife handy when I'm out in the field or doing anything with trees. Obviously where cankers happen, the tissue will die and the branch will die beyond that area. So it can be small twigs, die back within the tree, or even whole trees can be killed. All right, so just a general, very basic life cycle of canker-causing pathogens. So this is just showing one caused by a fungus. So rain or insects may carry fungal spores to a place on the tree that typically has a wound. And that may be caused by freeze injury, a narrow branch crotch, a pruning stub, a dead twig, a fresh pruning cut. So as you can see, most of the times these pathogens need some kind of wound to enter the tree. And then of course, dieback will occur, and then fruiting structures will form and the cycle will repeat itself. So cankers can be considered an annual canker, a perennial target canker, or a perennial diffuse canker. And an annual canker would be a pathogen that can only survive for one season. It grows and it's done. Of course, there can be multiple cankers on a tree, and so just they can be just as deadly, but a single area of infection typically won't cause too much impact on a tree. And an example shown here on the right is Fusarium canker. In the Intermountain West, it's not very common, but that would be a typical example of an annual canker. And then you guys may have seen this type of canker. It's called a target canker or bullseye. And what's happening is there's a balance between the pathogen, in this case it's mostly a fungus, and the growth of the tree. So the pathogen, the fungus, only grows when the tree is dormant in fall, winter, early spring. And then the tree responds by forming callus tissue around the area killed by the fungus. Then the fungus grows again, then callus tissue grows again, and on until you get this bullseye effect. And so a lot of times these types of cankers don't kill the tree, they don't kill the branch. It's just this very slow formation of these bullseye cankers. And Nectria is one example of this. And then finally, a diffuse canker. Those are the ones that are most deadly. So they grow, the pathogen will grow during the growing season. But they're typically saprophytes, meaning they can survive on dead wood. And that's really where they would grow best. But any kind of entry point to trees like those wounds, then they'll become very aggressive as a pathogen. And the tree is not able to grow any callus tissue to wall off that the pathogen growth. So chestnut blight, those of you from the east, you're familiar with this one. That will be an example of a diffuse canker. All right, so Megan, we have a poll question here. You guys can have a look at it when she puts it up. So in working with trees in your profession or hobby, how often do you deal with cankers? So I was curious about you guys, how often you actually see cankers. So there's 4 choices there, and you can just click with your mouse on your choice, and then Megan will show the results.
They're rolling in. I'm going to give 10 more seconds to see if everybody can vote. All right, 5 more seconds, and okay. There you go. Can you see the results, Marion?
Yes. So it's almost spread out between not too much and quite often. So that's good. All right. So do we close these ourselves, okay, Megan?
I'll get rid of it.
Okay.
There we go.
Thank you.
You don't see it anymore?
Yeah. Nope. It's gone. All right. So just general canker management. And then when I talk about specific cankers, I may mention a little bit more beyond what I'm going to talk about right here. But the 3 key factors are sanitation, removing those cankers, proper pruning, and making sure the trees are healthy. So there's been actually a lot of research that have shown that trees that are stressed by drought or nutrient deficiencies are actually a lot more susceptible to infection. They cannot fight off infection. So sanitation, so that just means removing the existing cankers that are found. And that's so important because I mentioned that these fungi, especially the ones that cause the diffuse cankers, can survive as a saprophyte. So they're living in this dead wood for many years, often producing spores and contributing to spread. So removing that dead wood as soon as possible. And make sure you get all of the canker out anywhere from 4 to 12 inches below the expanding line of the canker margin. And you can see if you make a cut where you think you've taken out a canker and there's no callus wood happening, or maybe there's even some more gumming along that cut edge, you know you haven't gotten the full canker, and it's going to continue to grow. And so you'd have to go back to that tree and recut. So here is a very crude example. This big branch here, some gumming, and you may assume, okay, this looks like a canker. And that brown rectangle, we're going to pretend is a branch. That's where you might make a pruning cut right at that branch. The branch looks healthy, so you may assume that a pruning cut right there would then remove this canker. But by removing the bark, then you can see the leading edge of the pathogen growing through the phloem. So you can see where it is brown compared to a little bit more cream colored tissue. So if that cut was made right there, the canker pathogen is still in the wood and would spread to that branch. So it's important to find that leading edge and prune beyond. All right, so that's sanitation, and just general proper pruning practices. As I mentioned, a lot of these canker-causing pathogens are associated with pruning cuts, whether they're fresh or old. And there was some research out of Colorado that looked at orchards that were pruned using good pruning practices compared to orchards that were not. And those that were had a 50% lower incidence rate of cankers than those that did not have good pruning practices. So it does pay. So you guys a lot of you are arborists, you know how to prune, but just to point out that these flush cuts are going to be very susceptible to infection and stub cuts as well. In fact, in the Intermountain West, this is where we see most of infections happening, is through these, the stub cuts that are left. So good pruning practices. If you have to make a somewhat flat cut, if you can angle it as much as possible, there's also been some work that has shown that that also has a large benefit in reducing the rate of infection, because the moisture is going to wash off the flat cut or the angled cut better than the flat cut. All right, so just a summary on this general canker management, removing the diseased limbs beyond the canker. And if you're pruning during the growing season, especially, if you're pruning out cankers, it's a good practice to disinfect your pruning tools, your chainsaw, in between cuts. And here at Utah State University, there's been some work that has shown that just regular disinfecting wipes do a good enough job of cleaning off your tools. And then you can really reduce the incidence of cankers with good pruning, clean cuts, angle those flat cuts. If you are pruning trees that may be marginally hardy or susceptible to cold injury, try and wait as long as you can in spring, summer to do the pruning, so that there's not a threat of cold injury, which will then be an infection court. And then again, don't prune in wet weather, okay? All right, so there has been, or if you go online and look up cankers, you'll see there's some recommendations on excising the actual canker itself, so the bark around the edges. And it does have some merit, where it can cause the pathogen right under the bark to dry out, maybe stop the growth, shown in this picture here. However, this picture in the center, you don't get the full edge of the canker, then it's just going to keep growing, and then you've caused a whole nother wound on the tree. So in some cases, it may not be the best idea. In New Zealand, actually, they have done some research on checking to see if a blowtorch might be effective in cauterizing the cankered area itself. And so they did a lot of experiments and trials with that and found actually no effect. So they're not recommending that as a practice. So Megan, we have another poll question, and I wanted to ask you guys if you have done any of these practices.
Yeah, we had a question here. What about a canker on the trunk? Would you recommend excising it?
Yeah, I mean, if that was something that you have experience with, and you feel like you could do a good job, yes, you could do it on the trunk.
And another question while people are voting here, single use on the disinfecting wipes. I would assume the answer to that is yes.
Yes, single use. Oh, that is actually a very good question, to be honest.
I mean, better to be safe than sorry, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, better be safe than sorry. I don't think that I need to talk to my colleague about what she did.
Okay. All right. And then one more question. We'll let folks vote. We have 404 people on and half have voted. Why not prune in wet weather? Oh,
yeah. So in wet weather, that's when a lot of the canker-causing pathogens are spreading around. And so you make a fresh open pruning cut, it's prime site for a new infection.
Okay, all right. And then ideal spring, summer pruning better than winter pruning. When is the ideal pruning time?
The ideal pruning time really depends on the trees that you're pruning. Apples, a lot of hardy trees can just be pruned in winter, no problem.
Okay.
So it depends on the tree.
All right, I'm gonna end this poll and y'all can see the results here. Can you see them?
Okay, yes.
Okay.
All right, good, thanks.
All right.
Okay, so now I'll switch gears to talk about some specific cankers. Cytospora is the first one, and it's a fungus. And there's actually over 500 different species of Cytospora, and over 600 trees and shrub hosts are susceptible. So some examples of the more common host species we see it on. So poplar, and that includes aspen, Lombardy poplar, the hybrid poplars. So Cytospora will cause this sunken bark area, flaking bark, and the discoloration. The 3 pictures on the right are on aspen. So associated with some oozing as well. And then we also see a lot of Cytospora on blue spruce. And typically those infections will start on the lower branches and may kind of sporadically work their way through the tree. We rarely see infections on the main trunk. So it's often easy to manage by pruning out those branches that are affected. And they're identified on the pictures on the left and the bottom with that pitch. Right where the infection happened. And then on prunus species like peach, shown here, nectarine, cherry and ornamental cherry, these trees will often show an associated very dark gumming with Cytospora infections. And they can occur on the main trunk, in these crotches, and again are associated with the wounds as shown on the right there, that pruning cut. Cytospora can be quite deadly. Here in the Intermountain West, we have had issues with peach growers having losses due to Cytospora. I want to make a comment, though, on this term gummosis. I showed those pictures with the very dark gumming on the trunk. And just for you all to be aware that gummosis can be caused by a variety of different factors. So there could be environmental stress that causes gumming. And I'm talking, for the most part, prunus species. So severe pruning can sometimes lead to gummosis, maybe the following year. Excessive irrigation, meaning the tree is growing quite vigorously. If it's planted too deep, so it's under some kind of stress, any little wound, if the tree is left to, if it's a peach tree, if it's left to bear fruit very heavily. So all that can cause some type of gummosis. It may be varying shades of color. This picture shown here, the gumming is kind of clear. And so to me, that tells me, well, this is probably some environmental induced gumming. And if I scrape the bark, the tissue underneath is nice and healthy. So that's a kind of a good way to identify what next step I might need to take. But borers can also cause gumming, and that may be, the gumming may be associated with some frass, and it may be sporadic throughout the tree. All right, so I mentioned, look under the bark, look for the discolored tissue to see, well, is this gumming really caused by a pathogen or not? And in this case, you can see that the phloem is dead, so yes, it is. And here too. So again, very dark, amber colored gumming, and I've scraped the bark away and the tissue underneath is necrotic.
Marion, I have some gummosis and Cytospora questions.
Okay,
you want to wait?
There would be a few.
Like rolling in. I got 23. What do you want to do? Keep going or? tackle a few of them?
I think I'll keep going and maybe, actually I changed my mind. I'll tackle a few.
Okay, is apricot susceptible to gummosis?
Yes, apricot is susceptible.
Okay. Does Cytospora on aspen usually occur with poplar borer, or do you know?
Okay, does Cytospora on aspen with poplar borer? No. The Cytospora on aspen is typically going to be through wounds. I guess poplar borer could cause a wound for entry, but there's no clear association in terms of movement of the pathogen.
Is peach tree borer a vector for Cytospora or a co-pathogen?
No, peach tree borer will not vector the pathogens.
Gummosis, do you remove the sap ball?
The sap ball on the tree has no effect on the tree health itself. It's what's happening underneath.
Okay. Will burning the canker material kill the fungus?
Meaning the cauterizing I was talking about before, I'm assuming,
yeah, I would assume
holding a, like exposing the canker and using a blowtorch on the wood of the intact tree. So there's been research that's shown no, that has no effect.
Okay. One more. Can you speak to ash Cytospora signs? Should we be sanitizing injection needles?
Ash. Well, did you say ash?
Yeah, ash.
Okay, I personally have never seen Cytospora on ash. I wonder if maybe you're talking or referring to ash anthracnose.
Maybe they can tune back in if you want to clarify that.
Yeah, we can go back to that one. All right, so maybe we'll move on.
Go for it.
Okay. Anyway, back to Cytospora, just the general life cycle, how it spreads. So it survives on dead bark, and again, it can survive for many years. And these on the right picture, those little black dots, are the fruiting bodies of Cytospora that contain, each little dot contains hundreds and hundreds of spores. The fruiting body is called a pycnidia. And the picture in the middle shows bark of a cherry tree where it's just kind of peeled away, and that's just exposing those pycnidia, so you can see them a little bit better. But with wet weather, rain, irrigation on the bark will then stimulate those pycnidia to form spores, and they often come off in these orange tendrils. And then wind-driven rain will deliver those spores onto throughout the tree or other places, and that can happen year-round. Okay, so managing Cytospora. So I've talked about the general practices already. And so the question is fungicides. Can that be an option? And I wanted to report on some information that's come out of Colorado State University by Dr. Jonas Minas, who has done a lot of work with his colleagues, Dr. Jane Stewart and others, in looking at the spread of Cytospora in peach orchards and how can it be reduced. So the goal is to reduce spread and infection from existing cankers, not necessarily to cure what's already there. So some of the findings over the past 3 years they have found is that when new trees are put in the ground, you want to protect them. And so the trunks can be painted with white latex paint. And using a 50% mix of latex paint plus water has been the standard recommendation. But they actually found that it didn't last very long, only provided protection for about 3 months. And so he's actually recommending to bump up the concentration of white latex paint to 80%. But in any case, mixing a fungicide, so Captan or Topsin worked the best of all the ones that they tested, with that latex paint, protected those new plantings from infection. And it would be repeated once a year, and it could be done any time of the year really, but fall would be, or at planting would be the best time. And then after 3 years, then those younger trees are pretty protected. So that was one thing that they have found. And then of course there's also these existing cankers. So another thing they tested is, well, if we paint over the existing canker with this same mixture, about 80% white latex, plus the fungicide, again, Captan or Topsin. What that does is it prevents the fungus from sporulating on that existing canker and thus prevents further spread. So it doesn't kill that canker, but it prevents more cankers from forming. Or an organic option they looked at is using Surround, which is a clay-like material, kaolin clay, with lime sulfur as an alternative option for organic orchards. And then finally, they looked at, well, is there anything that can be done after you prune the tree? Because again, that's when the trees are most susceptible to infection with those fresh pruning cuts. So again, we're looking at Topsin or Captan or lime sulfur for organic as a fungicide application to the entire tree to protect those fresh pruning cuts. Let's see. Oh, the other interesting thing they found on peach trees, there's a lot of copper application for various diseases. So if you use copper, you may be familiar with it, but just as an interesting side note, they found that the copper may actually, or had actually promoted or increased the canker infections in their study. So it's a little side note. Megan, are there any other questions about Cytospora?
Just a question about the latex paint. Does that allow for gas exchange?
What they found, there was no adverse effect to the growth of the tree. And Dr. Minas actually talked about spraying the entire young trees that are planted. And they looked at no adverse effects. They leafed out fine, so no.
Okay. Just one here. Are the Cytospora species specific to a host tree species, or can they jump from spruce to aspen, for example?
That's a good question. I know with the peach or the prunus, there are specific Cytospora species. I'm not 100% sure of the Cytospora species on spruce. As there's so many different species, I would assume they are different. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so I'll move on to a canker that is related in terms of its symptomology, and that's bacterial canker. It caused by a bacteria, Pseudomonas syringae, and commonly found on prunus species, ornamental, cherry, plum, etc. The interesting thing about this Pseudomonas is that it survives as an epiphyte, meaning it's not causing any harm on plant surfaces, other surfaces, so it's almost everywhere. And then under the right conditions, it will cause infection. And it works in a way that's also quite interesting. It has a special protein that is able to form ice crystals above freezing temperatures. And so those ice crystals cause damage to the plant tissue, and then the bacteria feed on the injured tissue. So it kind of works in an interesting way. But it can be deadly in certain situations. It thrives in cool, wet weather. That's when bacterial canker will be most active. So very early spring or even in the fall as well. Once temperatures gets hot, this disease or the bacteria itself is inactive. It's not doing anything. I wanted to comment that Pseudomonas that I'm talking about is the same species that causes a tip blight on a lot of different ornamental plants. So this lilac I'm showing here, that's a tip blight caused by Pseudomonas. So anyway, cankers on these prunus trees cause a lot of gumming. On the top left, the oozing may start out this sort of clear color and not be what you might expect. But as it ages and over time, it may get a little milky in appearance and darker amber colored. And of course, it can kill these large branches as shown in the bottom there. And the tissue underneath the cankered area or underneath the gumming will have kind of a fermented odor. So that's one way to identify bacterial canker from Cytospora. And the necrotic area will be somewhat streaked as well. So if I show you Cytospora necrosis on the right, where I've scraped off the bark, you can see the margin between the diseased and healthy. It's pretty much a solid cinnamon brown color with Cytospora, whereas bacterial canker, it's more, like I said, a streaked brown. Okay, so management of bacterial canker. Again, same as what I've already mentioned with the general management practices. And copper is often recommended for bacterial canker, but it actually, unfortunately, has a limited effect. You know, and it might go back to that work done out of Colorado State University that showed that copper, it causes tiny, tiny little wounds in the bark as it works. And so that may actually be not the best thing to use. So it's really bacterial canker, pruning out the infected areas. Okay, so Megan, we have another poll question. This one's more to test if you guys have been listening. On the slide, there's 3 responses, but go with what's in the question.
Give it another few seconds here. 420 people in the meeting room and 200 have voted. So go ahead and get your vote in. Remember, folks, if you have a question for Marion, put it in the Q&A window because I can't keep them all straight in the chat window. All right, 3 more seconds and okay, here you go.
Okay, most of you got it right. If you see gummosis, figure out what it is first before you do anything. Okay, thank you. All right, so another canker I wanted to talk about, general term is called bleeding canker, caused by a fungus relative called Phytophthora. So there's several different species of Phytophthora, and they are soil-dwelling pathogens. So that's not necessarily in the air, but I'll explain how they may cause a canker. So in the Intermountain West or in Utah, I've mostly seen this on maple, horse chestnut, birch, beech, and others. And what you're seeing in that video is a fruiting body that's releasing its spores. And those spores are swimming around and they won't survive too long, but they're looking for some bark to cause infection. So you look at that and you think, okay, well, this is a pathogen that needs water in which to spread. And that's true. So you wonder, well, how can it cause infection on bark? So it's really if moisture is being held against the bark or if there's splash from the ground. So in this example, this birch tree, this was an arborist that sent me this picture. And the client had white tree wrap around a white bark tree. So that's a whole nother topic. But anyway, I guess the white wrap had stayed there for a few years. And so underneath it, there had been these infections by Phytophthora due to the moisture being held against the bark. On the left is a horse chestnut. So it's just, some of these cankers are just these small circular areas with a slight bit of darkened coloration on the bark or a bit of ooze on the bark. But in this case, the soil is very compact. You can see the trees planted too deep. And so the water just bounce, as it rained or irrigation, water would just bounce off the ground onto the trunk of the tree, contributing to spread. Another factor that would contribute to spread is when irrigation just constantly hits the base of the tree. And obviously if the pathogen is present too. So in Nevada, maybe a decade or so ago, they had many reports of these bleeding cankers on silver maple. And so they did some investigation. There was concern because some of you may be familiar with sudden oak death, which is caused by a relative Phytophthora. But in this case, it was just these general Phytophthora species, bleeding canker, causing some dieback in the trees. And the picture on the left, it shows on the lower left, scraping off the bark where you can see the necrotic tissue right underneath that bleeding area. So with bleeding canker management, it's a little bit different because you have the rain splash from the ground. So reducing soil compaction or adding mulch to prevent that splashing. And it has been shown in this case that the cankers are pretty small, and so excising them may contribute to drying out and stopping the growth. And there was some work as well on using a fungicide called agrifos, and that is phosphorus acid fungicide that has efficacy against Phytophthora. And it actually works by helping to induce some resistance within the plant. But anyway, they excised the canker, sprayed it with the agrifos plus pentrabark, a surfactant, and found that it really helped prevent further spread. Any questions we should address, Megan?
No, I think there's enough that you should probably just plow through it.
Okay. All right, so thousand cankers disease. Yeah, I'll move a little more quickly so we can get to the questions. So this is a complex where the fungal disease is actually spread by insect, walnut twig beetle. And it was first identified from Colorado State University entomologists, plant pathologists about 10 years ago. And as of 2017, so this map isn't quite up to date, this is where 1,000 cankers occurs throughout the US. And we're talking black walnut for the most part, or species in Jugland ACE. So throughout the West, those states that are in orange colored is where they've issued a quarantine preventing movement in and out of the state of black walnut and wood. So it can be quite a threat to the native black walnuts in the East. So the walnut twig beetle is tiny. But if you're familiar with bark beetles, they have pheromones and attack trees by the hundreds. In fact, at Colorado State, they wanted to count how many beetles emerged from 2 pieces of wood. And it was about 23,000. So I should say they attack trees by the thousands. And with each attack in the tree, they're introducing this pathogen, the fungus Geosmithia. So there on the left is a canker that I have exposed, and right in the center of the canker is the beetle gallery. So the canker the fungus just grows right out from the center of that gallery. And on the bark, there may be some oozing, a little bit of discoloration associated with those bark beetle attacks and the cankers themselves. And with this multiple attack, then the cankers all kind of blend together and then kill trees. So symptoms in the trees would be flagging of the foliage, wilting, slight dieback, and then eventually followed by death within about anywhere from 4 to 8 years, depending on the host. So this just shows the different species within the Jugland ACE family and their susceptibility. So black walnut and butternut are the 2 most susceptible, and shagbark hickory the least. Wingnut on the far right, I'm not familiar with that one, but it's a new host that was identified in 2016. So this picture, I took this in 2009, and it shows those 2 dead trees are black walnuts, and on the far right is a Persian walnut or English walnut. So at that time it was felt that those walnuts were resistant, but that tree died within another 6 years or so. So managing 1,000 cankers is really a matter of preventing spread. So they're the twig beetles are so prolific, and it's very difficult to find their exit holes that spraying the trees is maybe not an option. But there's some monitoring that is done to tell if the beetle is active, and preventing spread, as I mentioned, is the key management practice. Getting trees out, cutting them down before they're half dead will help prevent further spread a little bit better than waiting till they're completely dead. Walnut lumber from downed trees may still have beetles in them, and so don't move that is a good practice. And again, check your state for your local firewood quarantine. This website, don'tmovefirewood.org, is a great option to really get some more information about this pest and about firewood movement. Okay, so some miscellaneous cankers that I wanted to mention. All three of these are caused by opportunistic fungi, meaning they're typically saprophytes, but they'll cause disease when they have the opportunity. And that's when the trees are drought stressed, nutrient stressed. So one example is cankers that can affect honey locust. So the one that we've seen mostly is caused by a fungus called Thyronectria, but there's a relative species, Nectria, can also cause cankers on honey locust. And the picture on the right there, you can see the bark in the center of that limb is slightly discolored, slightly orange in color. The bark may begin to flake, sink down, and there can be secondary borer attacks. So if you guys have eagle eyes and look real close, you can see there are some exit holes of honey locust borer on that limb. And it spreads with these fruiting bodies that form on the trunk and spread spores throughout the tree, just like the other cankers I've been talking about. So there are some honey locust species, or varieties I should say, that are more resistant to honey locust cankers. And that last bullet, the sunburst, is most susceptible, and the first bullet lists those that might be a little bit more resistant, like shade master. Okay, so this next one is also a fungus, Bacterial canker. The pathogen name is a little bit of a mouthful, so a lot of people just call it bot or bot canker. So it's a pathogen that can affect a wide host range, up to 200 different species. In Utah, or in the Intermountain West, I've most commonly seen it on dogwood and redbud. But the host list is quite long, and it causes the same symptoms that other canker pathogens cause as well, by turning the bark tissue a discolored, darker brown or to black color. Shown on the left there, that's on a pagoda dogwood. And then in the center on that Kusa dogwood, right in the center of the tree, it's hard to tell, is dead. And the affection was in this area here from an old pruning cut. And then on the right, you can see there's some flagging or dieback on the redbud from this particular canker as well. All right, so the third one I wanted to mention is a canker disease of aspen called hypoxylon. And in the West, aspen trees, the West, the Southwest, can live with this particular canker disease for many, many years. I've never seen it, but I do know in the eastern part of the country and the lakes region, on the aspen trees there, it's quite deadly. But the general symptoms shown in this picture here, on this very old canker, the bark will tend to flake off in a checkerboard format. And then underneath the bark, the wood tissue will turn black and be a very dark color. So those two pictures on the left are from aspen in the east, the northeast area. And this particular pathogen can also attack the xylem. So it has a lot more of an effect on the vascular system within the tree. And trees can die, again, quite quickly. But in the west, this picture on the right, this tree is actually still quite healthy with these cankers here, so they can coexist. All right, so I wanted to finish up with some symptoms on bark that can maybe mimic or maybe fool you into thinking it might be a canker. Flat-headed borers, which also attack stressed trees, but the feeding site will often cause, it kills the bark, the underlying tissue, so it looks similar to what you might see with a canker. So on the left there's swelling, the sunken area, and on the right, the bark is splitting, cracking. So that might be what you might think at first, but if you remove some of that bark away, then you can see the feeding galleries and what's going on underneath to try and tell the difference. So flat-headed borers may look similar to cankers. In the Intermountain West, we have seen these symptoms on honey locust with this pockets of ooze coming out for almost no apparent reason. But in the end, it was determined to be just an abiotic response to drought stress. So that underneath the oozing on all these trees, the tissue underneath was just healthy. So drought stress on honey locusts can resemble cankers. And then finally, you all are familiar, I'm sure, with cold injury or just sun scald, which is a huge issue with newly planted trees. And often the symptoms aren't seen until a few years after the sun scald had actually happened. So that concludes what I was going to talk about, and we can answer some questions.
Yeah, so if you want to tag team these, go ahead and click on can you see the Q&A window, Marion?
Yes. All right, so I have that open.
Okay, cool. So I'll just read one that pops out to me. Is it possible that tree injections for emerald ash borer may be spreading some of these pathogens from tree to tree? Can you speak to Cytospora and ash, for example?
As far as I know, I think I might have already mentioned I'm not familiar with Cytospora in ash. And I know the tree injections are at the base of the tree where you often don't see Cytospora. If it was there, these cankers would be up higher in the tree. So if there's maybe a bleeding canker that's happening at the base of the tree with these injections, then that might be the case. But I would assume that you're cleaning off your equipment in between use.
I'm going to go ahead and launch our evaluation poll, and we'll just plow through these questions. So when you have a second, folks, please go ahead and take this poll, but move it off your screen, just drag it around if you want to get rid of it for a second. Greg had a question. For those arborists that complete excavations of the root collar or root flares, do you have any experience triggering cankers at the base of the trunk when excavations are done late in the year or early in the year?
That's a good question. Because you're making those fresh cuts. Again, it's going to depend on the host. So most of our hardwood trees that you're doing these excavations on, your shade trees, I'm going to say, don't worry about it. And what I'm trying to say is if you're doing an excavation on prunus species, ornamental cherry, etc., I would do that in maybe the heat of the summer. Okay.
I'm going to let you, do you want to just scroll and?
I'm trying to see where we are. Sherman Anderson.
Go for it.
Okay.
So
mention and address the cankers common to aspen. So on aspen, I've talked about Cytospora canker, which is common. And then I mentioned the other one, hypoxylon. So, and they can be found at lower elevations in backyard trees. Yes. Any effect on canker expansion due to time of year when pruning is done? So our worst cankers grow for the most part during the growing season and expand during the growing season. So if you're pruning in winter, has little effect on the growth and spread of cankers. It's pruning in wet weather when the conditions are a little bit warmer that may contribute to spread. I think I might actually, Megan, start at the bottom.
Yeah, okay. Because
then
work
my way up.
Fresh. Yeah, go for it.
Okay. I'm not sure. The question from Carol.
Yeah, it's okay.
Okay, so Matt, are there any studies for the use of fungicide or Balaton trunk injections for the prevention or treatment of canker? So fungicide injections for the treatment of cankers? No, there's been no research as far as I know on that. I'm sorry. So the next question was a fungal infection on poplars. My guess is that would probably be Cytospora canker. So I showed some pictures of that. A website to buy products you recommend. I actually would recommend you go to your local farm or ag supply store. The use of they kind of change as I go from.
I'm sorry, because I'm marking them as the answer, but.
Oh, okay. I'm on Christina. Is there, okay, get the webinar. Roger asked, what about the use of systemic fungicides? Yeah, so there's as injections. So I did comment on that. There's not a lot of research on that. Not quite effective. Systemic fungicides are effective for sycamore anthracnose. So that's one example where it would work. Vincent, my treatment of choice for canker on aspen is a chainsaw.
Yes, so this webinar is recorded and it'll be on our website.
Someone asked about fire blight. I really wanted to cover fire blight, but I knew I wouldn't have time. I made all the slides, but I decided, can white latex paint be useful for sun scald prevention? Yes, that is the recommendation, or white wrap. You can purchase tree wrap. So either one.
Do you want to use Kenneth Butler? You scrape bark. Can you see that?
On Marion.
Okay, go for it.
Bacterial wetwood or slime flux could be considered. It could be considered a canker, but it kind of works its way up from the roots to the heartwood of the tree and out. And can it be treated? No, there's no real treatment for trees that are already affected. Ethan, when burning infected logs as firewood, will the pathogen spread by the smoke? No. Good question. Hypoxylon canker in the eastern U.S. management options. It's what I've mentioned for all the other management. Prevention of spread, removing where the cankered areas are. So Cody, we talked about disinfecting your pruning equipment, and you can just use like Lysol wipes, Clorox wipes. Those actually are great.
Yeah, somebody had a question about chainsaw disinfection.
I would just use a wipe.
Okay.
There is recommendations to use a 10% bleach dip, and that's also an option. It can be a little bit more corrosive though. Let's see.
Some people wonder if you would be willing to share your slideshow, and we can put it up on our website as well.
Yeah.
If that's cool. So yep, that's awesome. Thank you.
Should we keep going or?
Yeah, I mean, it's up to you. How much ever time you have.
Okay, so I am on Kenneth Butler.
Okay.
When you scrape back the bark to see the discoloration, does it expose the tree to further pathogens? So that is a good question because you are causing a wound. So you'd want to do that, scraping that bark away in the summertime on a dry day. So within a few days, then there would be a slight healing of that area. Okay.
Tell me where you're going and I'll just follow you.
I'll go to William Stump. Oh, slides. Okay.
So did you answer the bacterial wetwood or slime flux?
Yes, that.
Got it.
Okay. Elizabeth Grange says, what if I already applied copper for Cytospora? So as I mentioned, copper has shown not to be the best for Cytospora. If you're talking about other diseases like coronium blight, it does work. So I would say go back through these slides and you'll see some good information on Cytospora. That's for Elizabeth.
Okay. We still have 59 questions, so I say wherever you. People are confused about the Lysol. Does it really work? Does it really work?
Oh yeah, yeah. So what was tested was fire blight. Actually, it's bacteria, so it would work on fungal spores too.
Cool. Can you please touch on the
Yeah, I saw that. So I'm actually not familiar with that one. So
okay.
Sorry. It begins with an E. I do know that.
Okay.
I'm looking at ones that might be quick. RJ asked about wood chips, and yeah, wood chips are beneficial around not on near the trunk of the tree, but around the tree. So I would say yes, if you want to tackle that, do. So Richard asks, are there any walnut crosses or hybrids that show resistant to 1,000 cankers? They have not been identified yet, but there is a lot of work on breeding and finding trees. I know that there are some hopeful strains that they are looking at. So there's a lot of work in that area.
Somebody had a question. If the wound smells like alcohol, is it safe to say it's likely bacterial canker and not Cytospora?
Yeah, if there's some odor that's a fermented odor, I haven't detected an alcohol odor, but I would say, yeah, it might be more indication of bacterial.
You tell me when you want to, where you're going.
Yeah, so I'm moving up. I'm at Carl DuPault. I'm continuing up. Carl asks, is increasing cankers a result of climate change? I'm not 100% sure. It's really more a matter of wounds on trees and biological controls. People are making investigations, but that would be a whole nother topic. And yeah, I think that's exciting to use drones to inspect trees. And I know that there are some arborists that are doing that. I think you have to have certain licenses for that. That's an interesting topic too. I met Chris Madison. Calcium amendments to treat Phytophthora. These are all great questions that are stumping me. I don't have any information about that. Sorry, I don't know what Megan will type in that, but.
No, I'm just clicking it so it goes away. So
oh, okay.
Now we only have 54 questions.
Oh, okay.
So many, oh my gosh.
You can click everything that's below, say, Elizabeth Grange.
Okay.
Elizabeth asks, how do you inspect the phloem? Well, yes, you take a knife and carefully scrape the bark until you get to the inner tissue. Sometimes people think they've gotten to the inner tissue, but they're still looking at the bark and it's brown. So you might need to go a little deeper than you think. There's a lot of questions about injections, and that's so far it's not an option for cankers. The question from anonymous attendee says, Pseudomonas looks like fire blight. How do you tell the difference? Well, Pseudomonas is really an issue on peach, cherry. Fire blight is an issue on apple, pear. So it depends on the host. I'll help you tell the difference. Matt Mayo asked about the results of the peach orchard study. So I went through that kind of quickly. I was going to say, if you're still there, and if you wanted to contact me directly, we could talk more about it. Because there was a lot of good information, and I think that would take an entire presentation. Mm-hmm. So that was Matt Mayo.
Got it. Oh. Do you see Marion's question about the latex paint?
Yeah, so will latex keep, I don't think latex paint will do anything for emerald ash borer. So no. Another injection question. Okay, Miriam, that we answered that one. I don't know if anyone's still on.
There's 314 people.
Oh,
on,
okay.
So yes, people are very interested in your hearing what you have to say.
Okay, so I'm at Rachel Strite.
Okay.
Are you recommending always performing a fungicide application after pruning as a preventive? Well, that research was only done on peach for Cytospora canker. So I would say for now, that would be the only recommendation, because that's the only research I know of that has been done in regards to your question.
I think you addressed Elizabeth's question about copper, correct? I just applied copper hoping it could prevent it. Should I respray using Captain or Topsin?
So respraying would be only if you're, or applying that fungicide would be only after you've pruned the tree. So it wouldn't be kind of a dormant application. Can chipped wood from cankers be a vector that can spread it to newly planted trees? For the most part, when the wood is chipped, it's okay to use, especially if it's allowed to dry. I'm kind of pausing and hesitating, so I'm not 100% sure. I would say if you know the wood that you've pruned has been diseased, I would probably chip it and take it off to be composted.
Makes sense.
Okay.
I mean, better to be safe than sorry.
Yes. Cankers that attack Sitka spruce or mountain hemlock. Sorry, I cannot address that.
We still have 300 people on the webinar, so somebody else might. So if you have answers to these questions, feel free to stick it in the chat window, and then, you guys are all very educated people, so clearly by their questions, they have their.
Yeah, so that was Sitka spruce or mountain hemlock. Okay. I'm moving up to anonymous attendee.
Got it.
Burning. I don't remember the question from anonymous attendee.
Okay. It's okay.
Burning. I mean, burning the removed canker would be fine to do.
Do you want to do 5 more minutes?
Sure.
Okay, let's just do 5 more minutes. And then if you guys have further questions, Marion's email is up on the screen here. So grab it, send her an email, and yeah, thanks for sticking with us today.
So has canker, fungi, or pathogens been found to use borer entries as a point of infection? And for the most part, borer attacks have not been hugely important in the cause of cankers. Cytospora on apple trees? Yes, Cytospora can attack apple. You probably want more information, but so there's an aspen stand that's severely affected with Cytospora. I think that's a good idea to clear cut and let the clones come up or resprout, because it's just going to contribute to further spread. Gamosis.
Can gamosis occur due to old age of a fruit tree, especially a pie cherry tree?
Yeah, so it would be some environmental factor causing gummosis rather than the age of the tree. At what point is it better to remove a tree if 70% of the tree is showing cankers? Yes, if that amount of the tree is affected, the tree may not survive or produce very well. So I would take it out. Chainsaw disinfection. Okay, in Eastern Canada, we're told that heat developed by the chainsaw is enough to kill the pathogen. That's interesting. I honestly, if anyone wants to chime in on how hot a chainsaw blade might actually get, I don't know that it would be hot enough. I mean, we're talking 200 degrees, I would assume, might be, or 150 might be needed to kill some of the pathogens. I'm not sure. Yes, dipping is problematic. And then, so if anyone wanted to chime in on that, I'm going to skip tree growth regulators. Yes, Cytospora will be considered a diffuse canker. Is Cytospora native? Those, as I mentioned, there's many, many different species, and yes, they are native. Yes, there are similar conditions to cankers that may confuse you. So look for that discolored wood tissue underneath the affected area. We're always told not to seal pruning cuts. Is there a reason why not to paint over a pruning cut? Well, it's not necessarily going to harm the plant in terms of sealing over a pruning cut. It's just, for the most part, the plant can heal those wounds effectively on its own. Use Lysol. It's good to use. Spraying with Lysol. Lysol is good. Yes, Bex. Oh, I think are we at the end?
I mean, pretty darn close. There's a few in here.
I've skipped some.
Yeah, popped in at the very bottom, but I think we'll probably leave it there.
Yeah.
And everybody can see Marion's email, so write it down and look for this webinar to be posted on our website within 24 to 48 hours. Thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of your questions, but you guys fired hard today, so Marion's gonna have to go take a little cat nap probably. Thank you so much, Marion. I appreciate it, and everybody have a wonderful day, and keep an eye out for this webinar to be posted to our website. Thanks, everybody.